Hello everyone, I'm Stephen Cohen. I work at the Mirowitz Center and I am delighted to welcome all of you to this presentation today. Our center is very proud of its programs and activities, and we invite you to check out our offerings on our eBlast and on our Facebook page. Today we're especially delighted to be able to welcome Diane McCullough, who has a resume that, if I were to read it to you all, would take the entire time we've allotted to her program. So I'm just going to try and give you a taste of who this wonderful lady is. She taught vocal music and piano in the St. Louis Public Schools for 20 years until she retired in June 2007, since earning her master's in voice from Washington University in 1963. Her musical career has combined teaching with singing opera and playing ethnic music. She has also been a founding director for three non-profit organizations: Caramanta, the St. Louis Scottish Games, and Scottish Partnership for Arts and Education. Scottish Partnerships for Arts and Education was her brainchild, and she is their artistic director and their grants administrator. It was founded in 2006 and it provides free artist in residence workshops in Scottish traditional fiddle and Scots and Gaelic song. A woman who's so busy somehow also manages to find time to volunteer. From 2008 until 2020, she was the co-chair of the docent committee for Opera Theatre of St. Louis, where she also wrote listening guides which are used by docents as well as by teachers. From 2007 till 2017, she chaired the Entertainment and Sound Committee for the St. Louis Scottish Games. She's the chair of the Advocacy Committee for Opera Theatre of St. Louis Guild from 2020 until the present. And in addition to all of that, she serves as an elder at Webster Groves Presbyterian Church and on several committees for the Church and Presbytery of Gibbons Lovejoy, Dismantling Racism and Privilege Committee. Diane, welcome and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank everybody for joining in. So why don't we go ahead and start the video? It's about 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A afterward. And if you did bring up the handout, the narration that I sent you, that might be helpful now. And but if you don't want to look at that, I do encourage you to look at that afterward. It has everything footnoted in case you want to do some more research on this subject. And it has some other links as well for listening and for resources. So this is Voices Lifted, 2 Centuries of Black Composers of Opera. Greetings. My name is Diane McCullough, and I am a docent in the Opera Theatre of St. Louis Guild. Opera Theatre celebrates its 45th anniversary this year and continues to develop creative new programs. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a flurry of new thought, which I will detail later in this talk. This presentation will discuss the work and agency taken by Black composers of opera in the face of barriers of racism and prejudice. We will explore the musical forces that existed in both Europe and the United States that prepared these composers and subsequently placed them squarely at the heart of the development of an American sound in many genres of American music: folk, pop, jazz, and classical. And we will look at the ways that opera theater has responded. We begin in France before the American Revolution. Fencing master, colonel in the French Revolution, conductor, virtuoso violinist, and composer, Joseph de Bologna, Chevalier de St. George, 1744 to 1799, was considered the finest violinist and conductor of his time among the nobles and royalty of 18th century France. Bologna was born in the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, the son of a French plantation owner and Nanon, the enslaved woman of Senegalese origin. Nanon was 16 and Bologna's wife's maid. From the age of 8, he was educated in France. In 1757, his father was named Gentleman of the King's Chamber, serving as a personal assistant to King Louis XV. Joseph performed as a concert violinist and conducted several orchestras at the same time, composing works for orchestra. In 1781, he became conductor of the newly formed Orchestre Le Concert Olympique, which premiered Haydn's 6 Paris symphonies in 1786, with Queen Marie Antoinette in attendance. Although he was renowned as a soloist, conductor, and composer, he was met with barriers when trying to get his operas performed. When he applied for the directorship of the Paris Opera, 3 of the company's leading sopranos declared that they would not work under the direction of a mixed-race person. Nevertheless, he wrote several operas, managing to get performances in smaller private theaters. Los Angeles Opera presented the American premiere of his opera, The Anonymous Lover, in a virtual performance on November 14, 2020. Here is a brief excerpt. Bologna was seminal in developing a uniquely French genre for orchestra called the Symphonie Concertante. A hybrid of the Baroque concerto grosso and the classical concerto, a symphonic concertante usually featured 2 or more soloists in a virtuosic dialogue that emulated a musical duel. Bologna wrote 8 such pieces between 1775 and 76, a testament to the demand for them among French audiences. In 1778, Mozart traveled to Paris, staying from March to September and briefly under the same roof as Bologna, hosted by Count Sickingen. It is implausible, to say the least, that Mozart did not hear Bologna's music during this period. Intriguingly, Mozart's first composition after his return to Austria was his Symphonie Concertante in E-flat, Kerkel 364. And in an article published in 1990 in the Black Music Research Journal, Gabriel Banat points to the remarkable similarities between an excerpt from a Bologna violin concerto, Opus 7, No. 1, from 1777, and a passage from Mozart's Kerkel 364 from the following year, 1778. The gesture in question recurs in Bologna's solo string writing, a difficult sequence climbing to the highest register of the instrument, immediately followed by a dramatic dip, but had never appeared in Mozart's work until this presto in Kerkel 364. Here is an example from the Allegro in Bologna's Symphonie Concertante in G, played by the Bousquet Orchestra of South Africa. Celtic West African string ensemble traditions. Although it is not known whether Joseph Bologna's mother was a musician, the Senegalese have a long tradition of string music, both bowed instruments and plucked instruments. This is true of other West African cultures as well. Instruments such as the kora and the riti correspond to the Celtic harp and the eventual use of the violin or fiddle in traditional music of the Celts of Scotland, Ireland, Brittany, and Gaul. Players of the kora and the Celtic harp were even used in similar ways. The players were the clan historians, and they served the clan chiefs. In Mali and the Senegambia, kora players are in guilds made up of families that specialize in learning the histories and playing and singing them. The apprenticeship is a 7-year process where traditionally the son would go to an uncle for his 7 years of training. At the end of the 7 years, he was required to go from town to town, demonstrating that he knew all of the histories and the music. Let's listen to the African Classical Music Ensemble and Kase Madi Diabate. The English translation of the story he is telling is There Was a Time. You can hear how operatic this music is.
Jur. Así la va.
Allah mengana jobele kirifia muga kona te karafaga Sogo simoni simo salaba yakuba nukabala simo. Mariga nuru soma karabani soma mane soma foloni mani soma laba kanya mangoni nawara kungoba kelelo.
Both the kora and the Celtic harp are now played by both men and women, and players are playing both traditional tunes as well as composing their own tunes. It is not surprising that when enslaved West Africans were brought to the Americas, there were many musicians among them. At the same time, in colonial America, there were fiddle players from Scotland and Ireland. Old Williamsburg, Virginia, has documented the music being played there for dances and concerts, and most of it was Scottish in the earliest days. Robert Burns and other poets and folklore-loving Scots had begun collecting the poetry and song of their oral traditions, and by the late 17th century, these tunes were being published both in Scotland and England. Many of these publications have been found in Old Williamsburg and are listed in the replica manuscripts. Also found in the replicas is the mention that many of the fiddlers at the dances were black. Black fiddlers were both enslaved people and freed people. Being a musician was a skill that provided a bit of freedom to enslaved musicians and a bit of income to freed black musicians. Enslaved musicians were rented out, and most of the money they earned went to the white enslaver. There are many stories, however, of freedom being bought by these musicians after years of saving the small wages they may have received. As people moved west, both black and white musicians carried the music via the Ohio River Valley and into Missouri and the Missouri River plantations. Black fiddlers were still playing for both black and white dance parties all over Missouri as late as the 1940s and 50s. Bill Driver and Bill Caton are two examples whose music can be found on recordings. This brings us to the question of the music of Appalachia, which has been portrayed as a strictly Anglo and Scots-Irish phenomenon. This notion was introduced in the late 19th century by several early ethnomusicologists that visited Appalachia with the newly invented recording machines they brought to document their work. This was at the beginning of Jim Crow laws that codified racial segregation, and these writers played right into that mentality. Recent research is slowly disproving this monochromatic view. A terrific source of information can be found in Phil Jameson's book, Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics, Roots and Branches of Southern Appalachian Dance. It was the recording industry that greatly influenced our concepts of who played which music. Marketing strategies separated race music from old-time and later country and bluegrass. Recording companies were willing to record black musicians who played the blues, but increasingly less willing to present them playing other forms of popular music. Why have I spent so much time on roots of our folk music? Because just like with baseball or basketball, the more homemade ball fields and hoops people are playing with, the more players prepare themselves for an opportunity to make that sport their life's work. You can say the same for music. The more skill you build and the greater the pool of players, the more likely it is that musicians will explore other forms of music. The other thing is, symphonic and operatic forms of classical music require string players, and these string players were playing folk music. Black musicians were hearing the classical music of their times and also learning to read music. Many references are made to the musicians connected with the Hemmingses of Monticello and surrounding towns. Biographies of great Black Americans, from abolitionists to military men to poets, tell us that most played violin, and many also played piano and could play popular, folk, and classical music. Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous of these. His wife, Anna Murray Douglass, was a free woman and professional violin teacher in Baltimore. She read music and played both classical and fiddle styles. Douglass went to her for lessons while he was still enslaved, and one of their grandsons, Joseph Douglass, became a concert violinist and taught at Howard University. The musical milieu for 19th century Black Americans was deep and rich. There were many instrumentalists, fiddlers, violinists, pianists, and much more. When musicians didn't have a violin, they would make one from any number of materials, including corn stalks. Classical music was studied and played in concert. The violin was the lead instrument in very early New Orleans jazz groups. This is an area waiting for more musicological research. This leads us to our opera composers. African American opera composers in history. Wikipedia lists 20, 5 women and 15 men. We will look at 5 men who all wrote operas between 1868 and 1962. They are connected to each other in several ways, from actually being mentored or studying with one another, or through their connections to other forms of music, such as jazz and Broadway musicals. It appears that for Black string players, popular forms of music have always been a source of income when classical music institutions were unwilling to hire or commission African American classically trained musicians. Attitudes of white supremacy ruled these venues, even in the face of extraordinary talent and hard work. John Thomas Douglass, 1847 to 1886. In 1868, his opera, Virginia's Ball, was copyrighted. This title is logical for 1868. Douglass would have known the connection between Virginia balls and Black musicians. It was performed at least once that year at the Stuyvesant Institute on Broadway, but has been lost. Douglass was a renowned violinist, toured as a concert artist, and played in a string ensemble and in minstrel orchestras, including Hyers Sisters and Georgia Minstrels. Harry Lawrence Freeman, 1869 to 1954, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. By the age of 10, he was playing organ in church. At 18, he began composing, having been inspired by attending a performance of Wagner's Tannhäuser. By age 22, he was in Denver and had founded the Freeman Opera Company and the Freeman School of Music. In 1891, his opera Epithalia was performed at the Deutsches Theater in Denver. His second opera, The Martyr, premiered there in 1893. The Martyr was also produced by the Freeman Opera Company later in Chicago and Cleveland in 1894. This was the first opera in the USA to be produced by an all-Black production company. He moved back to Cleveland, married, and continued composing and teaching in Cleveland, Chicago, and at Wilberforce University, 1902 and 1903. About 1908, the family moved to Harlem, where in 1912 he helped Scott Joplin with revisions to his opera Treemonisha, which was produced by Opera Theater in 2000. Freeman composed at least 23 operas, many of which were successful in his lifetime but are not performed today. He was a colleague of musicians and artists in New York and is associated with the Harlem Renaissance. There is an archive of most of his scores and his papers at Columbia University in New York. Will Marion Cook, 1869 to 1944. Composer, violinist, choral director, student of Antonin Dvorak from 1894 to 95. Composed in many forms, including musical comedy, jazz, and popular song. Cook's father, John Hartwell Cook, became one of the first African-American lawyers in Washington, D.C. He was chief clerk of the Freedmen's Bureau from 1867 to 1872 and served as professor and dean of the Howard University Law School from 1876 to 1878. He and his wife, Isabel, were free people of color before the Civil War and stressed education. The younger Cook showed musical talent at an early age and began studying violin at Oberlin at age 14. He was exposed to African American spirituals while living with his grandparents in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and these melodies stayed with him throughout his professional music career. His Broadway musicals made great use of these melodies and of popular dance forms like the cakewalk. Although his concertizing was short-lived because of strict segregation of performers in the classical music community, he was nevertheless famous as a concert artist on violin. His stage works were performed on Broadway by the Black-owned company of the Johnson Brothers. Clarence Cameron White, 1880 to 1960, was the son of highly educated parents. His mother was a violinist, having studied at Oberlin. After his father's death, when White was 2, his mother moved back to Oberlin, where White's grandfather gave him his violin, with the stipulation that he never play dance music. In 1890, his mother remarried and they moved back to Washington, D.C., where White had the chance to hear Will Marion Cook in concert 2 years later. He was only 12 years old and fell asleep before Cook played. When he woke up and realized he had missed the performance, he was inconsolable. Cook heard about this and offered White violin lessons in the summer of 1892. Among other famous solo artists that taught White were Samuel Coleridge Taylor in London and at Howard University, Joseph Douglas, the grandson of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, mentioned earlier. White's career included performing, teaching, writing violin pedagogy, and composing. He wrote the opera Uwanga, which is based on Haitian themes. William Grant Still, 1895 to 1978. Composer of 150 works, including 5 ballets, 5 symphonies, and 8 operas. The best known of these composers, Still was the first African-American composer to have an opera produced by the New York City Opera. Born in Mississippi, he grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. Still started violin at age 15 and was self-taught on many other instruments before graduating high school at 16. He went to Wilberforce University, Oberlin Conservatory of Music, and was a student of George Whitfield Chadwick and Edgar Varese in composition. Howard Hanson considered Still to be the premier American composer and premiered many of his works at the Eastman School of Music with the Eastman Rochester Symphony. Still was the first African American to conduct a major American symphony orchestra, have a symphony, his first symphony, performed by a leading orchestra, have an opera performed by a major opera company, and first to have an opera performed on national television. He had a close association with Alain Locke and Langston Hughes and is considered part of the Harlem Renaissance. He worked with Freeman, Cook, and White and mentored younger Black composers such as Ulysses Kay. Still is an excellent example of the career trajectory of most African American classically trained musicians. He found work from 1919 on, arranging music for popular bands, starting with Fletcher Henderson and moving on to Paul Whiteman in 1929. Meantime, he played in the pit orchestra for U.B. Blake's musical Shuffle Along and was the arranger of Yamacraw, a Negro Rhapsody, composed by the noted Harlem Stride pianist James P. Johnson. In the 1930s and 40s, he arranged for Willard Robeson's Deep River Hour and Paul Whiteman's Old Gold Show, both popular NBC radio broadcasts, as well as arranging for films starring Bing Crosby, Jane Wyatt, and Ronald Colman, among others. In 1936, he conducted the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, becoming the first African American to conduct a major symphony orchestra in the USA. He went on to conduct other major orchestras, and his works have been played by the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, the London Symphony Orchestra, the Tokyo Philharmonic, and the BBC Orchestra. Here is an excerpt from the finale of the fourth movement of his Afro-American Symphony from 1930. His orchestration of the winds and his billowing effect, where the music seems to billow like clouds out of itself, is characteristic of his sound. Hearing of all of these successes, one would think that William Grant Still was one of the lucky ones who was allowed to find success. But the truth is that Still had to face many instances of racist decisions about whether or not he would have success. The most tragic incident, though, was surrounding his opera Troubled Island, written in 1938, with libretto by Langston Hughes and Verna Arvey, but not produced until 1949. The New York City Opera took on the project, and expectations were extremely high because of the successes of Still's symphonic works. Everyone connected with the production anticipated a huge success. The work was contracted for 3 performances over a 6-week time span. Before the first performance, John Briggs, music critic for the New York Post, told Still that all of the critics were going to pan his opera, and in fact, that is what happened. Even though there were 22 curtain calls for the composer at the end of the first performance, the critics were determined to scuttle the whole show. After the 3rd contracted performance, the opera has never been performed again. Here is Celeste's opening aria, which comes just after a very short overture. The text is, "Little black slave child, no slave to me. You are my son, child, who must be free. We are here, child, no place to rest. Lay your dark head, child, on mother's breast. Sleep now, my baby, sleep now, my son. Mother will free you ere night is done. Dream your sweet dreams, child, that have no name. Mother will dream now a dream of flame, flame that will sweep our slavery away. Sleep on, my little one, till the new day. Sleep on, my little one, till the new day." This was recorded live in 1949 at the first performance. What these composers had in common: they were all multi-talented, all were multi-instrumentalists, all made their living in popular forms of music and/or entertainment in vogue at their time, all were prepared for careers in classical music but faced racism and segregation, all were entrepreneurial and created their own opportunities where they could. After Still's rejection in New York, most opportunities for Black composers were found in college and university settings, where both jazz and new classical music were being premiered. New York City Opera waited 37 years until 1986, when they staged Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, to premiere another opera by a Black composer. Opera Theater of St. Louis has staged a revival of one and premiered 4 operas by Black composers. They are Under the Double Moon, Anthony Davis, 1989, Joshua's Boots, Adolphus Hailstork, 1999, an opera for youth, Champion, Terence Blanchard, 2013, Fire Shut Up in My Bones, Terence Blanchard, 2019, Treemonisha, Scott Joplin, 2000. And included in OTSL's 2021 season is William Grant Still's one-act opera, Highway 1, USA. Terence Blanchard quoted the great Wayne Shorter, one of his mentors, as saying, "Luck equals preparation plus opportunity." For preparation, he advised Blanchard to go down to the basement and find every note. In other words, dig deep. The composers mentioned here clearly were prepared, and a couple of them had opportunities while still living. Blanchard commented that for every Black musician that rises to the surface, there are at least 10 just as good who have been prepared but did not have opportunity. In Blanchard's case, Opera Theater of St. Louis's Jim Robinson and Tim O'Leary, general director at the time, asked for a second opera after opening night of Champion in 2013. It took a year to find the right material, and the rest is history. The Met has just announced that they will open their 2021 season with Fire Shut Up in My Bones. This will be the first time that the Met has presented an opera by a Black composer. Terence Blanchard continues a line of African American musicians who, yes, compose opera, and also are jazz composers and work in popular mediums, whether it be dance music, musicals, or film and TV. White American classical composers have borrowed massively from these musicians. Just as jazz is America's classical music, it is to these musicians that we need to look for a dynamic, synchronatic future for American opera. Under General Director Andrew Jorgensen, Opera Theater continues its commitment to Black opera composers and further into diversifying the administration and backstage aspects of opera theater. They have just announced 2 new programs, the Clayco Future Leaders Fellowship and Voices Fund, a path for empathy, dialogue, and change. In an interview on St. Louis Public Radio, Jorgensen said, Opera Theater is launching 2 initiatives to boost the presence of underrepresented voices in the predominantly white world of professional opera. We're talking about commissioning composers of color, commissioning women, commissioning voices that need to be heard. The first event sponsored by the Voices Fund was a concert on November 16th called Songs for St. Louis, a Concert in the Commons. Broadcast on the 9 network, performers were St. Louis native Angel Riley, soprano, Christopher Humbert Jr., and Ganson Salmon. All 3 are members of the OTSL Jardine Young Artist Program. The first class of Clayco Future Leaders Fellowship winners began work on January 4th. They are Leanne Alvarado, Administrative Fellow, Quentin Beverly, Advancement Fellow, and Chandler Johnson, Artistic Fellow. These new programs continue a long history of opera theater reaching out to underserved communities in the St. Louis region. Their AIT, or Artists in Training program for high school singers, celebrated its 28th year this spring. Addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, OTSL put into place their digital studio. The digital studio opened in December 2020 with the holiday concert and continues with Opera on the Go's Pirates of Penzance, the New Works Bold Voices commissions of 3 20-minute operas on love, and a digital La Boheme. OTSL's crowning glory, though, is the festival season. Opera Theater will return live and in person for its 46th festival season next May, reuniting audiences and artists for open-air, socially distanced performances. The 2021 festival season, which is planned to take place on the campus of Webster University, will open with the world premiere of the revised edition of Stuart Wallace and Michael Corey's Harvey Milk, followed by a double bill of William Grant Still's gripping Highway 1 USA and Puccini's light-hearted John Nischicchi. The season continues with a compilation of 4 dramatic stories about love and revenge titled On the Battlefield of Broken Hearts, and the annual Center Stage concert featuring singers from Opera Theater's Richard Gaddis Festival Artist and Jardine Young Artist programs. Opera Theater will also present a celebration of Black composers and singers in its first ever Juneteenth concert. Opera Theater's 2021 season will mark the 44th year of the company's collaboration with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. These programs all reflect OTSL's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Opera Theater is leading the way. Will we, as audience members, arts supporters, and producers, provide the opportunity for all those who are prepared? Opera Theater of St. Louis believes it is a priority. Thank you.
That was very nice. That was wonderful. And we will open it up for questions now. If anyone has a question for Diane, you can type something in the chat box, raise your hand. If you want to ask the question, unmute. So we're open for questions now. Diane, do you have something else you would like to add to that? You have to unmute, Diane.
This afternoon, Opera Theater is broadcasting at 5:30 an interview with the 3 composer libretto New Works, Bold Voices commissions that were mentioned at the end of the presentation. And that can be accessed on the Opera Theater website, and just click on their YouTube channel. That's at 5:30. In case anyone's interested, the composers and librettists will be interviewed about their works. Those will be presented, like I said in the presentation, they'll be presented digitally at some point as soon as we get the COVID clearance again for doing that.
Diane had provided, and I think you received in the reminder email, some supplemental documents that would go along with the program that was given today, and some, resources if you wanted to dive deeper into this topic. And so it should be attached to the email that you received with your reminder. So that might be helpful for if you would like to read some of those.
There are quite a number of references in the addendum to other possibilities for listening to the West African traditions, strings traditions, in case you're interested in that. That I suspect is the least familiar part of the presentation. And then also, if you're a person who has a chamber group or something like that, or play an instrument, I do recommend going on the William Grant Still Music website, because he wrote a ton of chamber music, all kinds, and beautiful violin sonatas and things like that, besides his operas, ballets, and symphonies. And then there's also a reference to Opera America, which is the umbrella organization for opera companies, and mostly in North America. This whole Western hemisphere. And they have information about every aspect of doing opera, but they also have a whole section on the Black experience in opera, from the singing standpoint and composing and that sort of thing. So those are in the addendum on the handout. Then there's also the cast list and the synopsis for Troubled Island. I'm really hoping Opera Theater will get interested in either doing Troubled Island or one of his other operas, Bayou Legend. Either one would be really, I think, welcome here in St. Louis. And I'm hoping the symphony will do some more. I know St. Louis Symphony has played some of his orchestral works, and I hope they'll start bringing him back. But one of the things that I think is important to know about Troubled Island, the cast, except for 2 singers, all of the solo roles were done by white singers. This is 1949 in dark makeup. But the 2 Black singers that were performing were Robert McFerrin, who was a St. Louisan, and the father of Bobby McFerrin, and then Ruth Stewart, who was a soprano, who then went on to teach at Southern Methodist University, and they have a whole building named after her, Ruth Stewart. So those are some factoids about Troubled Island. It's based on the true story of the Haitian Revolution. I know that the information in this talk is really dense, so it's kind of hard to wrap your head around all of the different facts. That's why I had so many different pictures of things to kind of give you that visual orientation there. Were any of you?
I believe Carla has a question for you.
That was a wonderful presentation, and I'm ashamed to say I knew absolutely nothing of any of it before this, but you have to start somewhere. Couple of questions. When you referred to a recent opera theater performance, did you say it was on HEC, the Songs for St. Louis? And is that archived? Do you know?
Songs for St. Louis, it was done on Channel 9, PBS,
Channel 9. Okay.
but it is archived. You can access it on the Opera Theater of St. Louis website.
Okay. And then I noted that several of the people that you mentioned studied at Oberlin. Could you comment on what motivated them to go there, or how that became pivotal as a resource?
They were one of the few schools that welcomed Black students.
I had a feeling that was probably it.
And they focused on music as well. I mean, they were they still are famous for their music school.
Thanks.
So
were you as surprised as I was to find that first composer being born in 1847 and then having an opera performed in 1868? You know, like I said in the quotes from Terence Blanchard, people were prepared, people were interested, people were there, and it's the real fact that we have to face of having barriers thrown up because of the racist attitudes, especially in the classical world of music. And even well, I started college in the late 50s, and at that time, the music history was being taught by a lot of refugees from Europe, you know, doctors of musicology who were very European oriented and even very orchestrally oriented. So they didn't even like teaching about opera, much less about American opera. And so there's a lot of interesting back and forth if you start reading William Grant Still, any of the books about William Grant Still. there's all kinds of rivalry and nuanced argument about whether there could be such a thing as American opera, who really represented it, what kinds of sources they would use, all kinds of things like that. And William Grant Still had lots of thoughts on the subject. So I do recommend, if any of you are interested in further reading, I recommend that you go to the William Grant Still Music and look at some of those books. His granddaughter, Judith Ann Still, started that company in order to make sure that the writings of Still and her mother, Verna Arvey, were available. So.
Well, we're getting very close to time. If we have any further questions, Barbara, do you have a question? No. You need to unmute. You need to unmute. Barbara, do you want to unmute?
Yeah.
There we go.
It was most interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'm really not quite sure that that's enough to say thank you to you. More than interesting, you've opened up so many doors for us, shared information that I think many of us have never been exposed to. This has been an absolute treat. Thank you so much, both you and the Opera Theatre, for making yourself available.
Well, my pleasure. I do recommend that you look at the footnotes in this document and read some of those books. They're not music history books, mostly. I've been working on these ideas for a really, really, really long time, and have put things together through a wide variety of reading, because nobody is writing about that. It's not surprising that you didn't have this information. This information is not together in this way any place. Even the music books just barely touch on things, and opera gets short shrift no matter what.
You should write. Sounds like a book you should write. You have all the material.
Well, I have at least 11, 12 pages of it.
And when you do write it, please promise to come back.
Thank you, Diane. It was a wonderful program. Thank you